Welcome to Walden Pod. I'm your host, Emerson Green, and today my guest is philosopher of mind Luke Roelofs. Luke studied philosophy and psychology at the University of Oxford, completed his PhD at the University of Toronto in 2015, was a postdoc at the Australian National University, and currently works at the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at NYU. Luke and I discuss split brains, the combination problem for panpsychism, material composition, and many other issues related to neuroscience and the metaphysics of consciousness. I'm joined today by philosopher Luke Roelofs. Luke, say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
So why don't you tell us a little about yourself and your interests? Yeah.
Sure. So I'm currently working at the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at NYU. I do find basically all aspects of the mind really fascinating, but I guess my primary focus so far has been on the metaphysics of consciousness, and in particular on panpsychism and the combination problem. So that's panpsychism is the idea that the best way to explain why human beings are conscious is that something inherent in just the matter of the whole universe is conscious or is disposed to create consciousness. And the combination problem is the worry that even if you do postulate that, you don't explain human consciousness until you've given an account of how the presumably very, very simple consciousness in, subatomic particles or whatever the fundamental physical things are, how they add up, how they combine to make the complex structures that we're familiar with in our own experience. And so I wrote a book called Combining Minds that was trying to explore some of those issues. So that's some of my interests.
You also have you work on empathy, right, and on like philosophy of sex and gender, and some political philosophy. Is that right?
Yeah, I have, and that kind of is spanning the range from published work in progress, work that I've kind of put out there, but that isn't in peer-reviewed academic settings. I am non-binary. And so I am very interested in explaining and defending the cogency of that sort of identity and the justice of the greater acceptance that trans people are fighting for. And I am also really interested in the idea that conscious beings have this special connection to imagination, that a being's consciousness is something that I can't understand from the outside, that I have to somehow put myself into their shoes to try and grasp it, as you say, metaphorically, from the inside. And that this is both closely connected to like what is special about consciousness, and also to the kind of the sense we have that we're obligated to each other, that we have to look at things from other people's point of view and kind of see the world through their eyes in a practically relevant way.
Yeah, I came across a presentation you gave, like I think 5 or 6 years ago on YouTube about amodal mind perception.
Yeah.
That sounds like it might connect to what you're talking about now with empathy and imagination, but the whole debate between perceptualism and inferentialism, whether like how do we know about other minds in the first place? Do we like infer their existence just from external behavioral indicators, or do we actually like directly perceive other minds in some way? And for me, I just thought everyone was some kind of inferentialist. I'm always surprised when I find out that there are non-inferentialists, I guess. But no, you kind of carved out this middle way that made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, because I do, in that presentation, I was sort of trying to have a cake and also eat it, because I think there's something phenomenologically compelling about the idea of mind perception, that I see your expression, I see your movements, I hear your voice, and the emotional tenor of that, the meaning, the intention, all of that can be present to me, immediately. I don't have to kind of wait and think about anything. It comes to me, as quickly as I can tell that you're human, as quickly as I can tell, physical things like your posture or various things about your identity in society. But I also recognize that there is this deep intuition of privacy, that other people's minds are, in some sense, only knowable to them, are not directly visible to me. Even if I can, in some sense, see your anger in your face or hear your meaning in your words, I don't hear it in the same way that you're able to apprehend it. There's something that remains at a distance. And so I think it's important to hold on to and preserve that idea of privacy.
Yeah, I mean, I always took that as not like a knockdown argument against physicalism or anything, but just sort of a red flag, I guess, maybe like an anomaly that there does appear to be something private, and yet we don't typically construe physical things as, kind of hidden from instruments or hidden from observation. Like it should all be kind of publicly accessible and publicly observable. And yet we know from our own case that there's something that's not publicly accessible and publicly observable. So it kind of, again, it's not like I guess physicalism is false then. Like, no, it's not that quick, but it is kind of a red flag for me, at least.
Absolutely. Yeah. When some physical property is hidden from a particular observer, there's always this idea that it could in principle be revealed to them. It could in principle be found by better instruments. And not just to them, but to anyone with the right tools and the right faculties, that it's in that sense public. And I think that's not just a contingent fact about how we happen to think of the physical world. I think that's built into what it means to call something physical. Physical means something like, expressible in the language of physics, in the language of natural science, which is an observational discipline. It's committed to this methodological publicity. And I don't think that means that, the things physics says are incompatible with there being a private, subjective aspect to reality. But I think it does mean that it can't in itself capture that there's something that will remain left out of any purely physical description.
And I remember asking an illusionist about this. I was like, doesn't your view kind of imply that there will someday be instruments, that could have access to my experiences in the same way that I have access to them? And he just said yes. And I was like, well, that seems kind of crazy. But I asked Keith Frankish the same question, and he didn't answer me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for an illusionist, that question is building in a false presupposition. It's like, if I ask you, is the King of France bald? No and yes are both wrong answers, because there is no King of France. And so I guess, as I understand Frankish's view, there is no form of access you have to your experiences. It's an access that you falsely think you have to experiences that you falsely think you're undergoing. And so, and for an instrument to replicate that could only mean like a delusive instrument, an instrument that, misled people, I guess.
But I mean, I have something though. Like I have the illusion of phenomenal consciousness. Like there's something that's happening to me right now, and it should all be out there, right? Like, I mean, delusive or not, like it should be publicly observable in the same way that my brain events are publicly observable, if that's all there is, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak too much on behalf of illusionists, because I share your feeling that ultimately this just cannot be true. Like I think it's incompatible with, in a sense, literally all my evidence, because all my evidence ultimately comes through things that I'm conscious of. I do recognize, though, that there's this interesting question within illusionism about how far the illusion is a cognitive one and how far it's a perceptual one. Because if you read people like Dennett, who are kind of forerunners of illusionism, or people like the Churchlands, they make it sound like we've all just kind of bought into a bad ideology. It's something at quite a kind of belief-like cognitive level. And that once we sort of free ourselves from those bad thoughts, we'll be able to see the truth of the world fully. And And it kind of sounds like you'd stop having the impression that you have conscious experiences, which doesn't sound very plausible. And so more recent illusionists, like I think to an extent Frankish, I know also Francois Camera has kind of dwelt on this. They really try to play up the sense that no, it's something that's deeply built into how your brain works to generate this immediate but completely false impression of having experiences. And of course the trick there is, well, how do you even express the impression of having experiences without making it sound like it's the experience of having experiences, which would make the view collapse. Although of course, as I say, my rendition of illusionism is likely to be a little unfair, given that I'm not an illusionist.
Well, it won't be as unfair as mine, for sure. I've been reprimanded by many other non-physicalists where they're like, okay, look, I'm not an illusionist, but you are like taking it too far. You're straw manning them to some degree. And it's like, okay, I'll try not to do this. But, I don't want to get too far afield because I want to just talk about the combination problem mostly. But I will just say that illusionists often say true and interesting things about philosophy of mind. Like you have a whole paper about this area of potential overlap between Dennett and panpsychists, like how the multiple drafts model can kind of be like adopted by panpsychists to some degree. So again, it's not like so balkanized where it's like, oh, just because illusionists make this one move at one point where they kind of turn off a cliff, it doesn't mean that everything they say is wrong or something like that. Like, yeah, they often say true and interesting things about consciousness, in my view.
Absolutely. And I mean, part of what I was leaning on in my Dennettian panpsychism paper that you just referenced was, like, I think there is something that's very defensible about these hardcore illusionist or eliminativist sorts of view, which is that they recognize the gradualness and the continuity of nature. That there's no magic threshold where light hits my eye and then at some point along the neural pathway from there towards me saying, oh, I saw something. There's no sudden moment where you can go from purely physical to physical plus something else that's non-physical. Like, I don't think that we can find a point where you could draw a boundary. And of course, as an illusionist will say, well, therefore none of it really has anything non-physical or anything that's left out of the physical description. The panpsychist says, in a sense, the opposite, that everything, at every stage, there's something that's left out of a purely physical description. But they can agree that there can't be a moment when the lights sort of snap on as if by magic.
Right. That's why, I'm really attracted to these vagueness arguments against physicalism. And it's like, the illusionists kind of take that, to its logical conclusion where they're like, no, like in a sense, if I were to present the vagueness argument to Dennett, then I think that he might just kind of go along with it in a certain sense, like where he might actually accept like, yeah, that's not a bad argument that there shouldn't really be phenomenal consciousness if physicalism is true. He's like, well, I don't believe there is phenomenal consciousness. So, yeah, it is this kind of gradual, when does consciousness emerge? Oh, it's like when the day becomes the night or something. There isn't really this hard and fast boundary, like this sharp boundary, which is what we would expect if physicalism were true. And, but if you want to make that work, you've got to give something up.
Yeah, because most things are vague. Most distinctions that we draw, they turn out to be blurry. Certainly, if you look, closely enough, things that seem sharp on the macroscopic level often turn out to be blurry on the microscopic level. The tricky thing is that it's hard to see how that can be true for anything that's genuinely fundamental. If there's something that is, just one of the basic building blocks and can't be analyzed as like a messy way of talking about degrees of something else. Like, when does day turn into night? Well, we can accept that that's vague because we can embrace the thought that, well, day and night aren't fundamental descriptions of this. There's just degrees of light in various different places of various different wavelengths. And so it's messy because it kind of collapses into all of these other variables. But those variables, you keep pursuing them. What do they mean? What do they mean? At a certain point, things have to be a certain way or not. If the language you're using is really like your ultimate base language.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems like it's either like something or it's not. There's no borderline case of seeming or borderline case of like subjectivity. Like it can't kind of be like something, because then it would just be like something.
Exactly. And so so there's this intuition a lot of people have that consciousness seems to behave like a fundamental property in that regard. It seems that either there's something it's like, there's some subjective aspect, or there's not. And you can say, well, there's an in-between, but under scrutiny, the in-between always turns out to be, oh, there's something it's like, but it's very faint, or it's very vague, or it's very simple. The idea of something that's genuinely neither subjective nor not, I share a lot of people's sense that I can't really make sense of that.
Yeah. Now, and this whole conversation about vagueness does like bear on the combination problem as well, which I guess we should just get into here. But I've been wondering about the connection between mereology and the combination problem. And this is part of why I recommend your book to everyone who asks me about the combination problem, because this connection between material composition, the special composition question, whatever, like under what conditions do some objects compose something? Like, there's a connection between the combination problem and that area of study. And you kind of make that connection more explicit, I think, than many other panpsychists. So I think, now this, I'm not sure if you totally agree with me here, but I think that the combination problem is really just a special case of this more general like composition problem. Like, if you can answer how or why anything combines, then I think that would transfer over to how consciousnesses can combine. So is that going too far in your view, or what?
No, I think I broadly agree with that. Like a lot of what I try to do in combining minds is to situate questions about how minds combine in, within the context of how do other things combine. Partly because a lot of the things people say when they're pushing the combination problem, when they say, look, minds can't combine, when you kind of really look at their premises, it looks like they're actually advancing claims that imply that nothing should combine. In which case I'm inclined to say, look, this is not a problem for panpsychists. This is a general problem with, either with the idea that we live in a world of the sort we think, or more likely with your premises. So like Trenton Merrickx, for instance, argues that there's no such thing as baseballs, because if a baseball did exist, well, what would it do? What would be its role in the world? Anything that a baseball does is already done for it by the particles arranged baseball-wise that we want to say it's composed out of. And he says, well, look, you've got two different things, producing the same effects. It violates Occam's razor. Simplify your ontology and cut out the baseball. And I want to say, look, the very bizarreness of that conclusion should lead us to think that actually it's a mistake to see them as competing. Like the baseball and the particles that make it up aren't like two things competing to produce the same effects. They're the same thing described in two different ways, or the same portion of reality, I sometimes like to say, seen from two different sides.
So the claim is like, because there's nothing really for a baseball to do, like anything it would do would be kind of redundant or like an over-determining force. And let's just get rid of baseballs. It's all just Mereological simples arranged baseball-wise. And I think what you're saying is, if you get rid of baseballs, then maybe you should re-examine the steps that led you to get rid of this like common sense picture of the world that includes baseballs.
Absolutely. Okay. And I mean, I also have like a slightly more conciliatory, approach I could try. I could say, okay, let's embrace this result that there are no baseballs. There's nothing in the world except the whatever the most basic ingredients are, superstrings maybe. Clearly then all of the properties that we're used to attributing to baseballs and to, you know, human bodies and couches and snowshoes, you know, those can belong to superstrings when they're arranged in the right way. Okay, so then the challenge for panpsychists shouldn't be explain how you get, you know, genuine wholes, composite mind. The challenge should be explain how a group of simples, you know, a group of these tiny conscious superstrings could collectively have the experiences that we tend to attribute to ourselves. And I think that, you know, you're then going to recapitulate a lot of the other issues that come up around the combination problem. You've really just rephrased stuff more than you've substantially shifted things.
Okay.
But what I think is unfair, you know, that people only adopt that kind of like those kind of premises that rule out composition only when you're talking about minds combining.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, Mereological nihilism does kind of creep into the formation of the combination problem sometimes. Like in the, I guess I should explain what that means in case people are. So, like, there's this general issue of material composition, like when do things come together in a way that a genuine object is formed? So, an extremely reductionist, anti-realist view is Mereological nihilism, where there really aren't any objects. You can find some physicists expressing this view where it's like there are just like particles arranged object-wise. So there's not really any such thing as a table or a baseball or a cat or a tree. It's just particles arranged tree-wise or cat-wise or something like that. But it would be a mistake to think that there's something more than just that. So then there's the more moderate view, which I guess is like the most common sense view, which is some kind of restricted composition, where are sometimes objects and sometimes just collections of things arranged object-wise. And then there's the universalist view, which is sort of an unrestricted composition, which, as I understand it, is closer to your view. So I actually brought up some results here from the 2020 Phil Paper survey because I was somewhat surprised by this. Mereological nihilism, even though it seems like it gets a lot of airtime, a lot of people talk about it and kind of implicitly endorse it, especially when they're talking about panpsychism, they suddenly become Mereological nihilists. But Mereological nihilism is endorsed by 8.19% of philosophers, which is a little bit lower than what I would have expected. So less than 10% of philosophers accept Mereological nihilism. Restrictivism is at 35%. Universalism is at 27%, 3 times as popular as nihilism. And the rest are agnostic or undecided or something like that. So restrictivism, which is kind of the common sense view, that has the plurality, but universalism is a close second. So, and nihilism is kind of out there, I guess. So one approach that I've taken to sort of addressing the combination problem, at least obliquely, is like, hey, we can motivate these non-nihilist views totally separately from panpsychism. Like whatever arguments people are making in the realm of material composition for restrictivism or universalism, we can just make those arguments and adopt those positions. And then once you adopt panpsychism and connect it with something like restrictivism, it's kind of unclear to me what's even left of the combination problem, because you've already admitted that things can combine. You've already admitted that genuine composition can occur in the world. And isn't that just the combination problem? Like, how do consciousnesses combine?
Okay, so I mean, can I draw a distinction between the special composition question and the general composition question? These are both terms from Peter van Inwagen, who kind of introduced these phrases, and who puts the special composition question in the terms that you've presented. You know, when is it the case that for some set of things they form a whole? When is it the case that, you know, as well as, you know, A, B, and C, there's the composite thing ABC? And yeah, the standard answers are never, sometimes, and always, which kind of gives you a sample of how useful philosophers are when answering questions sometimes. But he contrasts that with the general composition question, which he admits is much harder and that he doesn't really have much to say about, which is, well, what is composition? You know, if on some given occasion a set of things, A, B, and C, form a whole that we call ABC, what is its relationship to them? What do we mean by saying that they form a whole? And my suspicion, what surprised me in the survey results that you just gave was how many people are agnostic. And my suspicion is that part of that agnosticism, I'm kind of speculating here, but part of it might be people either not being sure, how to understand talk of composition, or thinking that there may be multiple notions in play. Because sometimes I think people pose this question when is there a whole, and they're thinking of wholes in quite an inflationary way. A whole is something that is more than the sum of its parts. It's something that has a special unity. But other times people, and I think especially universalists, people who think that any set of things compose a whole, for them saying that there's a whole is a much thinner claim. It's just saying that we can describe these many things as one, and that there's nothing kind of false about that description. So my suspicion is that a lot of nihilists might be universalists if they embraced a thinner notion of what composition is. And a lot of universalists might well be nihilists relative to a thicker notion of what composition is. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but I think that the survey results might indicate that once you learn more about this issue, that the thing you're talking about kind of kicks in, and then they become universalists. They're like, oh, I thought I was a nihilist, but I'm a universalist, actually. I was thinking about this the wrong way. But can you outline a little bit more, what is this connection exactly, and what is the real disagreement between universalists and nihilists?
Yeah, so I think, here's one way that you could kind of argue yourself into nihilism. You could consider various supposed wholes that we encounter in life, things like, shoes and ships and sealing wax. And you could try to give, a philosophical account of their boundaries, their identity conditions, their causal powers, what place do they have in the world? And you might find that doing so swiftly involves you in all sorts of paradoxes. Some of those paradoxes might be about vagueness. You might recognize, there's no sharp boundary between what is a part of this ship and what isn't a part of this ship. And so, and then you might start thinking, well, what about, the two ship-like objects, one that includes, a particle more than the others? That means there's two ships here. Or you might think about identity over time. You might consider the ship of Theseus that I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. You take away every plank one by one and you replace it at the same ship. Or you might consider arguments like Merrick's, that if your view of the world contains all the parts of the ship, there's no need to have the ship in there as well. And you might have this kind of realization, that the ship is much less real than I thought. And you might express this by saying there is no ship. Fundamentally, there's just particles, there's just atoms in the void. But what I'm actually thinking here a little bit of some of the Buddhist dialogues where they'll say similar things about I think a chariot is an example that's discussed, and it's kind of similar to the ship of Theseus. What is there to the chariot beyond the wheels and the spokes and the parts? The chariot itself, exists only by convention, they'll say. But I think universalists often have this attitude where they think, okay, I can accommodate all of that by saying the ship or the chariot or all these other everyday composite things. What I want to say is that they're not fundamental entities. Their identity conditions can be vague. They may be partly a matter of social convention. This might be expressed by talking about reductionism, that they're reducible to something more basic. Although people have lots of different definitions of reduction. But once you have this language of saying, well, okay, I won't deny that there's any ships. I'll just say ships are a non-fundamental, ontologically superficial kind of thing. then I can kind of capture what I wanted to say without going as far as this kind of very radical nihilistic move. Yeah, so that was kind of what I had in mind. Just to kind of add, just as I was sort of saying that illusionists and panpsychists have something in common in not wanting to locate a magic boundary anywhere, I think nihilists and universalists tend to have an agreement that there aren't any super special holes. And so people like Trenton Merrickx and Peter van Inwagen, who we've mentioned, neither of them are quite nihilists. They say there's no such thing as baseballs, there's no such thing as tables, but they want to say there is such a thing as people. And they say that's because people have special, strongly emergent causal properties. They have properties that are not traceable to anything about their parts. They're not vague. They have these precise boundaries. They have, Van Inwagen has a slight complication of how he sees their boundaries. But the idea is that there are special holes that are kind of uniquely picked out among the different things that we tend to think of as composite holes. And I think a lot of both nihilists and universalists, and more broadly kind of naturalistically inclined philosophers, are united by the sense that we don't think there's anything like that. The human organism is not a whole in a way that other things in the world aren't.
Mm. Yeah, so for Van Inwagen, it's like there are no baseballs or tables, but there are brain stems. There are definitely brain stems.
Yeah, but
I have
stems that aren't brains, like there aren't heads. Like he doesn't want there to be ever a set of overlapping minds, which I think forces him to some very surprising conclusions.
Yeah. So how does this? I guess like you might think it's too quick to say, all right, well, let's defend this particular view of composition, and then once we combine that with panpsychism, then there just is no combination problem. I mean, how would one
get that
quick? Yeah. So I guess why do you think that would be going a little too like glazing over some important parts?
So Van Inwagen has the special composition question: when do things compose a whole? He notes the general composition question: what is it for things to compose a whole? There's another question, which is how the properties of a whole relate to the properties of its parts. Crucially, I always want to stress that I'm including the relational properties of the parts, the way that they're related to each other. And that, I think, is in some ways the really interesting question. I think Van Inwagen doesn't discuss it so much because for a lot of physical properties, it looks like it's easy but detailed to answer. That is, for explaining how the liquidity of water relates to the polarized behavior of its parts. It's a complicated answer, but it's also not an answer that provokes a lot of philosophical puzzlement. Like, we don't feel like there's a hard problem of explaining why water is wet. And I think a lot of the combination problem is really focused not so much on, when is there a whole, but on how do the properties of the whole relate to the properties of the parts. And I think that whether you're a universalist panpsychist, whether you think that every set of things composes a conscious whole, which is my view, or a more restricted panpsychist, that will determine like the contours of your challenges for answering that question about the properties. But I think that a lot of the real challenge lies in answering the property question. And so figuring out when you think there are holes is kind of just setting you up to address that.
Can I ask you one related question? It's not it doesn't directly bear on what you just said, but there was a question I wrote down. I was like, I have to remember to ask him this. So if someone takes like a restrictivist view, does that require strong emergence? Like, would you have to buy into strong emergence to think that there are, I don't know, genuine holes? I know that you can sort of put this in a way that kind of implies that it would have to be like, if you keep adding these kind of like superlative traits like true unity, genuine, whatever, like you could keep adding to it. But in general, do you think that in order for one to be like a restrictivist, to think that there are, there are holes out there, does that require strong emergence?
I don't think it requires strong emergence, but I think it goes naturally with strong emergence, because what it requires is a non-arbitrary way of drawing the boundary. And if there were strongly emergent properties of certain holes, certain properties that appear at a particular moment and aren't reducible to or predictable from anything about the parts, that would give you a very clear non-arbitrary reason for saying these things are holes, and something a little bit less integrated that didn't see the emergence of these properties, that's not a hole. Without that, I think you have options, but you're in a bit more of an awkward position. That's I think how I would see the views as connecting. If we're just talking about restrictivism, about composition per se, rather than about conscious composition.
So what about conscious composition? If you thought that happened, would you have to be an emergentist?
So what you would have to say is that either the consciousness of the whole that accompanies some sets of parts and not others is strongly emergent, or that you can derive kind of a priori from a full description of the micro level why some wholes are conscious and others aren't. In particular, you'd be under pressure to either derive an explanation of why the boundary falls at a certain precise point, even though, as far as we know, the micro level, everything is pretty continuous, pretty gradual. Or you could embrace like a sort of non-standard view about vagueness. You could say it's metaphysically indeterminate where the boundary is, but there is a real boundary, and that is somehow entailed by the micro level facts about micro consciousness. I think that sociologically there often is a correlation between emergentism and a restricted view. I don't think that there's a necessary entailment, but I think rejecting emergentism puts a lot of pressure on the restricted view. I mean, that's why in my book, since I'm trying to avoid anything strongly emergent, I do construct this kind of argument from vagueness for a more or less universalistic view. And I think there are avenues by which someone could try to resist that, but I think they have their costs.
Yeah, no, I think that might be one motivation for people kind of backing into nihilism. They would agree that, it might be counterintuitive, but if I reject nihilism, then wouldn't I have to buy into some kind of strong emergence? Like if I think there are true unities, like these objects that, like you say, like are more than the sum of their parts or something. I think that's how some people approach this. And they think, well, I'm not going to buy into strong emergence. That doesn't make any sense. So then they back into this view that everything is just, symbols arranged object-wise. Yeah. So, but you think that's kind of a mistake, though, right?
I think that if that differs fundamentally, maybe I shouldn't overuse the word fundamental here. I think that if that is substantially different from the kind of universalism that I would prefer, then I think it's a mistake. If it's terminologically different, I think it's a way of phrasing things that invites, I don't know, needless objections, is more confrontational than is needed. I mean, maybe to fill in a bit of the missing part here. So part of the argument that I outline in the book relies on a certain answer to Van Inwagen's general composition question, namely the thesis that composition is identity. And so this is the idea that when we say that three things, A, B, and C, compose a whole, we're not really talking about a distinct thing. Rather, the whole just is them. It's them described, as one rather than as three. But that's more to do with our way of describing it than kind of the reality of it in and of itself. And I think, well, okay, the most famous universalist was David Lewis. He's also the most famous kind of defender of a view pretty close to composition as identity. He hums and haws a bit about whether to quite commit to the full formulation as it is identity. He just says it's very, very similar to identity. But I think, rounding away the technicalities, if you think that every set of things composes a whole, that's much easier to think if you think the whole just is that set of things. You're not really, peopling the world with all of these extra wholes. You're just recognizing that any set of things can be described as a whole, can be validly seen as one.
I get what you're saying. It's just it's the universalist picture just at first blush is so counterintuitive. I mean, your first thought is always just like, well, the sun, my right pinky, and my cat is not an object. Like I don't know, can you speak to that sort of it's like the first kind of objection that people tend to have when they hear about universalism?
Yeah. So there is this worry that it's just too bizarre to countenance for us to accept that the sun, your right pinky, and sorry, what was the other component part?
My cat.
Your cat, yes. Compose a whole. And I think, what I kind of want to echo is what Lewis says, which is, well, there are lots and lots of wholes in the universe, but most of them aren't of interest to us. Most of the time when we talk about things composing wholes, what we're talking about is things composing interesting wholes that are more useful to think about than their parts individually. Now, it's not more useful to think about the sun, your cat, and your pinky finger as a whole than it is to think about them individually, because that entity doesn't do anything. We can't make any predictions about its behavior that would be more informative than just saying, well, what will the sun do? What will the cat do? What will your pinky finger do? And so Lewis thinks that our everyday language is much more narrow. It's much more restricted in what kind of things we consider worth talking about. But of course, there's no problem at all with regarding worth talking about as a vague term. We can accept that, the things that are interesting to us or useful for us to represent and give words to, that's vague, that there's no sharp boundary between the things that are worth naming and aren't worth naming. The pressure away from trying to draw a boundary only comes when we're doing metaphysics, when we're asking, well, is there a thing? Because Lewis thinks that, look, existence is one of the most fundamental notions we have. So while we can accept that being useful for humans to talk about reduces to more basic, the various different goals that we might have and the various ways that something might impact them, existing or not existing can't be reduced to that. Existing or not existing is just one of the basic ingredients of logic. So it's, in our most fundamental description of things, you've got to either exist or not. There's no in between.
Right. So there is going to be, these two separate questions, like what is useful to talk about, and then what actually exists as an object, I guess. So, and the thing is, this isn't unique to universalism. Nihilists, even if they don't believe in anything, supposedly, they still use useful, terminology. It's not like nihilists don't talk about tables. Of course, you can talk however you want. You can talk in a way that's useful, even if you don't think there's anything there, or if you think that there are things there, you can still just, your everyday language can still just be restricted to whatever is most useful, regardless of the metaphysical truth.
Yeah, and people will draw analogies to things like, saying, oh, the sun rises and it moves across the sky and then it falls down beyond the horizon. And, of course, the sun is not rising. The sun literally cannot rise. That doesn't make, it's not on the Earth's surface. doesn't move against gravity. We're describing how things appear to us in a way that's useful for everyday purposes, even though we know that the underlying truths are quite different, that we're rotating. Even there, we're not rotating. The Earth is rotating, but we express that by saying we are rotating. I think, a universalist or a nihilist both have to give some account of how does common sense relate to this picture we have of the fundamental world? And they can both agree that the person who wants a restricted view of composition to capture the common sense intuition that some things compose wholes and some don't, that person is making kind of the opposite mistake. They're trying to start from common sense language and requiring the fundamental metaphysics to answer to that. And I think it is more reasonable to allow the fundamental metaphysics to come apart from everyday language and then explain how you can reconstruct what we're interested in from a common sense perspective out of the distinctions and the gradations provided by the fundamental metaphysics.
So to go back to my pinky, the sun, and my cat, we recognize it's not a useful way of talking about the world. It's not an object that we would recognize in that sense. But the universalist hypothesis does mean that it is an object, though, in some sense, right? Even though it's not useful to talk about it, it is still an object. So what does that mean exactly for the universalist?
Yeah, what does it mean to be a thing? I think the standard answer that someone like Lewis would probably give might be to appeal to what he might think is the most fundamental language we have available, which is predicate logic, or presumably whatever more refined versions of logic we may devise in the future. To exist is to be is for it to be true to say there is an X such that X is you. That is, you would tie it to the function of the existential quantifier. Other people might not like that kind of logic-based approach. They might just say, look, being a thing is indefinable. They might just say being a thing is just the most, it's the single most basic trait anything can have. Anything is a thing. So anything is an object. Some people might say, look, objects are actually only one particular sort of entity. See, now I'm reaching for the word entity because I want something more general. I might say, look, objects are distinct from properties, events, processes, and relations. Although at that point I'm inclined to say I don't know whether the sun, your pinky, and the cat are objects as opposed to properties or events or processes, because I don't know whether the sun is better seen as an object or as a process. I'm kind of attracted towards thinking that the world is maybe more process than object. If Spinoza is right, then in some sense we're all kind of properties. Fundamentally it's just that the one thing, the one substance, nature, it's suns, it your cats, and it pinky fingers, and moreover, therefore, it sun, cat, pinky fingers.
QED.
QED. But maybe I could just pick up on this distinction between, things existing in the fundamental metaphysics and being very permissive, very widespread in what things exist, and then being more restricted in everyday language. Because I think how that plays out in the combination problem is actually really interesting. Because, the way that I divide up the book, I have a couple of chapters that are specifically for panpsychists, people who think that, like existence, consciousness is a fundamental property, who really lean into that intuition you were talking about earlier. Either there's some consciousness here or there's not. There's no way to kind of reduce that to a kind of vague summary of more fundamental facts. And for them, I say, look, the most consistent option is going to be universalism. Not only does the sun, cat, finger exist, it's conscious. It has experiences. Although again, we have to remember that here we're talking about the kind of the most fundamental ingredient in our everyday thought about consciousness. It doesn't mean that the sun, cat, pinky finger is intelligent, doesn't mean that it could tell you about its experiences, doesn't mean that it kind of can reflect on them or shift attention among them. It just means that it exists and there's experience there. There's something it's like. And because I kind of found this on a kind of composition as identity, I want to say, well, that's really no more than recognizing the sun exists and there's experience there. Your cat exists and there's experience there. Your pinky finger exists and there's experience there. And we can count them as one, and we can count their experiences together.
Yeah. See, this is now we're starting to get on this one topic where I feel like I have to like make a confession, sort of like. So a pretty common rebuttal that you hear, well, rebuttal quote unquote, is that like, oh, if panpsychism is true, then rocks are conscious, and like this weird thing is conscious, and that weird thing, that seems wrong. So like, they could make the same sort of move that we talked about earlier. Like, you should re-examine the steps that got you to this place that said rocks are conscious. And it's like, okay, yeah, fair enough. But, if I take the sort of Galen Strawson approach to things, where has a very common sense orientation towards all these things, you can just ride your common sense all the way to panpsychism town. But, just setting that aside for the moment, like whenever people say, rocks are conscious, that sort of thing, I always tell them, no panpsychists think that rocks are conscious. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking like, it's not that I'm lying exactly, but I do have a rationale for what I'm saying, which on some level isn't true. But sometimes I'll at least say like, well, look, there are some people like Luke Roelofs, who would think that everything is conscious. But what he means is like different enough from everyday notions of conscious, and like once you understand his views about composition and about what he actually means by conscious, it actually would be misleading to just walk up to a person on the street and say, hey, Luke Roelofs thinks that rock is conscious. It's like what they're thinking is so far away from what you mean by that I don't really feel bad about telling people that no panpsychist thinks that rocks are conscious, because what they mean by conscious, and even rock, like you have such a different view about the physical world and what it is, that it's just like their idea of what that means to say rocks are conscious is just nothing like what you mean by that. So I don't really feel bad about saying no panpsychists think.
I guess I want to stop short of saying it's nothing like what I mean. What I see myself as doing is pulling apart elements of the everyday conception of consciousness that are often kind of combined, run together. And I think in this regard, I'm just following a very common practice among philosophers of recognizing, to begin with, that everyday talk of consciousness is often ambiguous between self-consciousness, access consciousness, and phenomenal consciousness. This is the terms introduced by Ned Block. He calls it a mongrel concept. Sometimes when we talk about being conscious, we mean we mean something quite impressive. So I'm fully self-aware. I've gone to a consciousness raising feminist group. My consciousness was raised. I've become more self-aware about the conditions of my life. Other times we just mean, okay, a certain event in my brain is conscious if I can tell you about it, if I have a pretty low level sort of awareness, sort of access to the facts about it. And then sometimes we mean there's something it's like, there's some quality, some feel to it, which, and usually we mean some kind of confused mingle of all of those. And it's only one of those that poses the hard problem of consciousness. It's phenomenal consciousness that seems so different from anything that can be characterized by physics, that generates the explanatory gap. And so panpsychism, as a response to the explanatory gap, is really only talking about phenomenal consciousness. And so the sense in which, everything, whether that means like all the fundamental particles or, as on my universalist view, even rocks, the sense in which everything is conscious is purely phenomenal consciousness, which, we have to make a certain effort of mind to separate from access consciousness, and certainly from the connotations of, consciousness raising or attaining class consciousness.
Right. Or just any of the other number of things that people sometimes mean by consciousness. Like sometimes people mean thought, sometimes they mean language. Like, I mean, just to defend myself a little bit, like one time I heard David Bentley Hart say, in his characteristically humble way, he was like, well, panpsychism is false, obviously, because I haven't had any good conversations with rocks lately. And it's like, well, that's what I mean when I say, like, well, what Luke means is nothing like what you mean.
Yeah. Now that said, I do want to also give an account of these other senses of consciousness. So, chapters 3 and 4 are really just about phenomenal consciousness, and they're kind of pitched at panpsychists. What should a panpsychist fundamental theory look like? Sections 5 and 6 are then okay, so how do we get something sort of like an animal mind, something where we can talk about not just phenomenal consciousness, but access consciousness, something where we can talk about, absorbing and processing information in a useful way that guides behavior. And I think there's really interesting stuff to say about how minds combine there, even if you're not a panpsychist. Like panpsychists need an account, but non-panpsychists also, should be wondering, like, what if you cut a brain into two brains, or you put two brains together to make one brain, and kept them doing their consciousness-y things, like what's it going to be like for the whole or for the parts? And then in chapter 7, I talk somewhat briefly, but I try to talk a bit about self-consciousness, about this sense of self. If I really am a combined mind, if I have a composite subjectivity, what should we expect my self-awareness to be like? And why is it the way it is? Why do I feel like I'm just one thing if I'm actually many? And so I do think that they can all be talked about, in a way that is ultimately supportive of panpsychism. But I think they need to be talked about somewhat separately, because they're going to have very different properties, and they're going to be distributed in the world in very different ways. Which I think, and I think, to go back to your original question, when we just ask what is a rock conscious, without distinguishing the different senses of conscious, there's not going to be a single good way to answer.
Right. I mean, some of what you're getting at there, it sounds like we're starting to go into easy problem territory, which is obviously a misnomer, but just that, Chalmers' distinction of problems that neuroscience seems capable of handling in some sense, or just like natural science seems capable of handling. Like, I mean, it's good to talk about it, but it's not like, well, if panpsychism can't explain, how we gather, like, or how we attain self-consciousness, or, some of these like more specific questions, like, I don't really think that panpsychism per se is, designed to, it's like I mean, neither does physicalism answer these specific questions. These are both like very general metaphysical hypotheses.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot that I agree with there. And I think I say a few times, kind of in those chapters of the book, I say, the panpsychist's job, can't be to, explain intelligent thought, to explain language, to explain all these things, which, we have psychologists and neuroscientists and philosophers working really hard to explain, and they're making, in a lot of areas, impressive progress, but there's also a long way to go. What you can expect a panpsychist to do is to demonstrate, how their fundamental theory, could plausibly gel with what's being discovered in those areas. Why there aren't going to be huge paradoxes or deep disconnects. But it's more kind of a troubleshooting than an edifice building. Is kind of roughly what I would like to say. And so like I spend a bit of time talking about like case studies. I talk a bit about the split brain phenomenon, and talk a bit about social groups, because I think it's maybe the best way forward is to kind of work through like what would a panpsychist have to say to be consistent with plausible answers to these, as you put them, kind of the easy problems, the complicated but not fundamentally intractable problems about how does intelligence kind of get put together.
Actually, the first time I heard about you was in the context of split brains. I think Philip Goff mentioned it somewhere, just about how you were kind of connecting these case studies to the combination problem. So, like, what are the split brain cases, or just the relevant aspects to them, to our discussion, and like, how does it bear on the combination problem?
Yeah, so the split brain case is this rare, but really interesting phenomenon in I guess experimental neuroscience. I mean, strictly it's not experimental; it's medical. So what happened was some people had very severe epilepsy, and one of the big problems was that it was spreading across the whole brain whenever it arose in one hemisphere or the other. Obviously, I'm simplifying here. But and the brain has these two hemispheres, and it has this information superhighway between them. And people thought, well, maybe we can reduce the severity of these seizures by cutting that superhighway, cutting the corpus callosum to disconnect the two hemispheres from one another. Now, to be clear, it's not a complete split, because the two brain hemispheres are still connected to the brainstem. They're still connected to the midbrain structures. They're still connected to all of these things that are kind of further down. But to a substantial extent, they are no longer able to communicate with each other the way that they were before. And and before doing it, you might have wondered, are we going to have one person afterwards? Are we going to have two people stuck in one body afterwards? And the results were really puzzling, because they kind of seems like both results were seen. So on the one hand, the split brain patients were, seemingly normal in almost all everyday circumstances. They seemed to be able to talk and relate to people as one individual. But on the other hand, in certain experimental contexts, whenever you were able to segregate stimuli so that certain things were perceived only by sense organs that would go to one hemisphere and not the other, you seem to get the really interesting result that the person could only respond with the motor organs associated with that hemisphere and not the other. And so the kind of the standard way of presenting this is, so the two hands are each controlled by one hemisphere, and the two halves of the visual field are each go to one hemisphere. And so if you show a word and it's only visible to one half of the visual field, say the word is key, then that's only seen by the hemisphere that controls the left hand. And you ask the person, okay, could you, out of this pile of objects, could you reach and get the object that you just saw the word for? And they'll pull out the key with that hand. If you ask them to do it with the other hand, they say, I don't know, I can't see it. If you show the word ring on the other side of the visual field, they can pick out a ring, but only with the hand controlled by that hemisphere. And if you show them the word key and the word ring, which object you get picked out depends on which hand is taking it. And they will not pick out the key ring, which an ordinary subject would see key ring and would pick out a key ring. So it looks like there's a failure to integrate the stimuli. There's also a kind of selective response. You can respond to one set of stimuli with one set of motor organs and not with the other. And so that kind of looks like there are two minds here. And there's even some indications that some of the kind of seemingly normal behavior in everyday life might be a result of like subtle, almost communication between these two minds, that each of them could kind of cue the other to, for instance, move the eyes so that information was now going to both hemispheres. Now, there was a lot of initial enthusiasm among philosophers about how kind of mind-bending this is. Some of the empirical research that's been done more recently has suggested that, well, maybe some of these results might not replicate very well. It's hard to tell whether that's, just that the patients themselves have, their brain has changed for, neuroplasticity. It's a thing. And a lot of these results are kind of like, it depends whether you're using the eyes or the nose. There's a lot of complexity to it. Elizabeth Schechter has come out quite recently with a really good book called The Mind's Eye, where I is the letter I, kind of going over all of these data in a bit more detail, but arguing that there really are two minds here, even though they each think of that there's one mind. So she says, in a sense, there's one person but two minds, because they work together and see themselves as a single person. So that was a lot to say about what it is. You also asked, how does it relate to the combination problem? I mean, essentially what it does is it loosens the grip of our kind of everyday conception, where there's always one mind, it's perfectly integrated. If it can combine two smells, then it can also combine any other two experiences it's having, and it will be self-aware as a single mind. It will behave as a single mind, and this all kind of lines up neatly. And it shows, what it shows depends on which interpretation of it you prefer, and there are a bunch of those. But it at least shows that different aspects of what we would think of as the unity of a mind can come apart from one another. And that to that extent, it must be possible for things that are multiple minds, that are not unified in one respect, to come together and be unified in other respects. And so I think it does help the combination program of wanting to see minds as being able to be put together slowly from other minds.
Yeah, no, because at first when you just set up like what it is and what's going on, it's like, that is so weird. And like, you kind of think about, wait, why do I find this so weird? And it's because of these kind of underlying assumptions and intuitions about the self and the subject and about combination even. But yeah, if you interpret those results in a certain way, and it's obviously not like a matter of consensus about how to interpret them, but if you interpret them in a certain way or a certain set of ways, then yeah, it does kind of seem to break down some of those intuitions that go against panpsychism, in support of like a really difficult version of the combination problem. Like, and it's not like a fringe interpretation of these results. Like, it's a pretty mainstream way of seeing what's going on here. And it does kind of seem to fly in the face of the whole idea that like subjects can't combine or be split or something like that.
Yeah, and it also kind of goes back a little bit to we keep talking about vagueness and continuity. Someone with my kind of lots of subjects combining framework in the background can agree with people who say that there are two minds in the split brain case. They can say, yeah, there's a mind associated with each hemisphere. And they can also say there's a mind. They can also agree with the people who think there's just one mind that's subject to some interesting internal dissociations. They can say there's one mind associated with the whole brain, because I don't have to see those as conflicting. I can say, look, there's three minds. There's one mind with two parts which are less unified with each other than they would normally be. Because I think that I myself am already one mind with parts. It's just that in my case, the parts associated with the two hemispheres are much more fully unified than in the split brain case. But I can treat that as a matter of degree. I can say, if you could construct a spectrum of cases between me and the split brain with progressive, interference with the corpus callosum, in which the degree of integration between my two hemisphere mind parts gets gradually less and less. And that means that I have the resources to see this division, this difference between me and the split brain case, as ultimately a matter of degree. Whereas someone who thinks, well, either there's one mind or there's two, is kind of forced to say, well, if there's two minds, then there must be some point, on that spectrum where one becomes two. And it's harder to make that out as a matter of degree. There aren't really degrees between 1 and 2. I mean, there's numbers like 1.5, but we don't know what it means to say there's 1.5 minds there.
I sort of want to like turn around and examine some of the underlying intuitions that kind of support that, I guess, that like make people think that there is something, that there's some kind of problem here to begin with. You know, I mean, physicalists love I mean, some of them like to claim how they don't trust a priori reasoning and don't trust their intuitions like non-physicalists do. You know, you know, I mean, obviously they do. It's kind of difficult sometimes to show that, like, well, it's not difficult to show. It's kind of difficult to get them to acknowledge sometimes that they are engaging in a priori reasoning or just trusting intuitions that they might not have good reason to trust. But there are a few examples of that. But I think one of them is this basic intuition that, like, subjects can't combine. Like, consciousnesses just aren't the kinds of things that can be like composite or something. Like, you know, there's not really like scientific evidence for that. If anything, there's scientific evidence against that. And I mean, other than just their armchair a priori intuition, I don't really know what supports it. I mean, there is this one, I think it was William James who, I think you could say, like, discovered the combination problem, I guess, like, in the Principles of Psychology. And he gives that example. There are two quotes, I think, that under contract every panpsychist has to mention every bit of panpsychist writing. One of them is the Stephen Hawking quote about breathing fire into the equations, and the other one is William James talking about the combination problem. So he kind of says, like, you know, you get a 10-word sentence and then 10 men all know one word in the sentence. You put them together. It doesn't matter how you put them together. They're not going to suddenly all know the sentence. It's something like that. I don't know it exactly, but and I don't know if panpsychism implies that you should be able to squish people's heads together and form another subject. But I don't think that supports the general intuition that subjects can't combine. Like, just because you couldn't, like, squish people's heads together and form another subject.
Yeah. So there is this passage where James talks about the sentence and says, you know, you can get them to stand as close to each other as you want, and there'll never be an awareness of the whole sentence. And so part of what's interesting there is that there are like different threads from within that quite kind of evocative example that people pull apart. You know, so one thread that I know Philip Goff has kind of pulled on a lot is this intuition of like a conceivability argument. This thought that, look, for any set of parts, or for any set of things that have some conscious properties, I can conceive of them without conceiving of them as forming a whole that is conscious at all. And I think that strand actually is going to be very much bound up with our earlier discussion about, like, what is it to form a whole? Like, what does it mean for there to be a thing that is the 12 men together? And what does it mean for it to have these 12 conscious experiences? But there's another aspect that is about consciousness of the whole sentence. Because look, even if I solved that first problem about, you know, is there a conscious whole here at all, you might think all that would get me would be potentially like a conscious whole that has consciousness of 12 words. But there's the difference between 12 words and a sentence. You know, for one thing, the same 12 words could form many sentences. And this is why, you know, you always have to pay attention to the relations. It always matters how the parts are related. And so part of what a panpsychist has to do is explain how, you know, consciousness of 12 word bits could form consciousness of a certain sentence. So how could 12 experiences become a single complex experience? And as you yourself said, partly that's just going to be the general psychological, you know, inquiry into, like, how do we form complex representations out of simpler representations? Everyone recognizes that we do that in some way. You know, it's got something to do with how information about them is being processed by the complexity of the brain. The panpsychist's specific commitment, I think, is that you could get that distinctive relation, that relation by which, you know, the experience of the word the and the word sheep becomes the experience of the phrase the sheep, that binding relation, that could obtain between two distinct subjects, that it could potentially obtain between the experience in the one man's head and the next man's head. But you're right, the panpsychist doesn't have to say that it would happen just from pressing the heads together. They can say it would require more than that. I think they should say it would require informative interactions by which the exact state of one brain, is sensitive to the exact state of the other brain, and vice versa. And we have a very low-tech version of that. It's called talking. And the thing is that these 12 men in the line, they do have a way of bringing about consciousness of the full sentence. They can each say the word, and thereby they each kind of share the information, and they could come up with the experience of thinking the whole sentence. And James might say, well, that's cheating. That's like a non-mental relation. But I think the panpsychist's whole position here is that there's no real distinction. The saying out loud is just a low bandwidth version of what one of my cerebral hemispheres does to the other. And if we could make it, higher bandwidth, if we could find, faster, more efficient ways to connect the brains and allow them to communicate, at a certain point along that spectrum of increasing reliability and speed and bandwidth, you would actually get to a point where it's effectively a single very big brain with 24 hemispheres, spread across multiple skulls. And at that point, there's no more problem in that thinking the full 12-word sentence than in my 2-hemisphere brain thinking a 12-word sentence.
So, things have to stand in a certain relation. It can't just be any old relation. But I'm wondering how that relates to the universalism point. So it seems like things do have to stand in certain relations, not just any old relation to some inexperience.
Yeah. In order to form particular sorts of complex conscious whole, the thing is, complex consciousness, pretty much almost by definition, is not going to itself be a fundamental. At least I don't think we should regard it as a fundamental. I think consciousness is fundamental. I think that there are presumably some very simple set of, the basic ingredients of any conscious state. But, the consciousness of a 12-word sentence, the experience of, consciously saying to myself, the sheep jumped over the lazy dog. That's not 12 words. Sorry, I should have had a 12-word example. That's not going to be one of the fundamental properties of the universe. That's going to be reducible to a combination of simpler, but still, phenomenally conscious properties. And what I think universalism will hold for is whatever those most basic conscious properties are. So just to kind of spell out how I'm thinking of this working, let's go back to the sun cat pinky. So your cat probably has some moderately complex conscious experiences. And your pinky probably doesn't. And the sun, I take it, probably doesn't. So, your cat, let's say, has visual experiences of the shape of a door, a square shape, whatever. And that presumably will have to be subjected to some sort of analysis into the simpler components processed in the brain, angles, shapes, colors. I guess not our colors, because cats have a different color spectrum. And those, I'm going to say, are associated with experiences rooted in particular brain areas and brain systems. And those, in turn, are reducible to subsystems that are even simpler experiences that are too simple for us to really know what they're like. They're kind of alien to us, because even though they're here in our experience, we always experience them in a particular combination. All the way down to whatever the most basic experiences are present in atoms and molecules and subatomic particles. I think that and those very simple things are also present in your pinky finger and in the sun. I think the sun pinky cat composite inherits all of these very, very simple experiences. It also inherits the complex experiences of your cat, but they're not functionally embedded in that whole in such a way as to be attributable to it. So your cat's desire experiences guide your cat's whole behavior. They don't guide the overall behavior of the sun pinky cat. Moreover, the experiences in the sun and the experiences in the pinky and the experiences in the cat aren't put together the way that different experiences within the cat brain are put together. So there's no further complexity added. Sorry, I feel like I hope I answered.
No, I think your answer.
Moving pieces in the view.
Yeah, no, there are so many moving parts. It's hard to and there are so many interesting threads that I want to pull on. I'm kind of having to choose where to go. But I think that I wanted to talk about experience inheritance, and the micro-unity hypothesis, which is kind of like in the background of what you're saying there.
This is going to be about phenomenal unity, which is something that we haven't taken as a distinctive topic so far. But yeah, it is worth talking about.
Yeah, actually, I mean, before I read this thing from Combining Minds, about phenomenal unity. So I'm having experiences right now. This is another kind of like quick answer to the combination problem I've made somewhat dismissively to people in the past, where it's like, okay, I'm having experiences, plural, right now, like visual, auditory, tactile, emotional, cognitive, and so on. And these all appear in one unified phenomenal field. Like they appear to be combined, if you will. So like, I don't know how exactly, but it is happening somehow. Like, so, I mean, do you think the fact that experiences can combine like bears on the combination problem? Because it does seem like my auditory and visual experiences are combined into one unified field here.
Yeah, I do. And so when I was talking about the split brain phenomenon, one of the things I said was, at a minimum, it shows that some of the different things that we put together under the heading unity of consciousness can come apart. And so I think it's worth kind of returning to that thought that my consciousness right now, it's unified, and that actually means a number of distinct things. So one of the things it means is what you're putting in this field language. All of my experiences are just here together for me, being experienced together in this quite basic way. It also means, for instance, that almost all of my experiences are consistent with one another. There's pressure on me to for everything to kind of fit together. I don't generally have wildly conflicting visual experiences. The way that I hear things is influenced by what I see. The beliefs that I form and the thoughts I have are influenced by what I'm perceiving and all of this. There's also that binding that I was talking about with the 12-word sentence. Different representations are bound together into complex representations. I kind of like to think of that as things being pegged to particular points in my conscious field. They're not just there together, but they're there in particular experienced relationships. And phenomenal unity is a term that people have developed for talking about just that first thing, which seems to be kind of simpler and more basic than all of the rest of it. Like, even if the elements of my experience kind of blurred and they weren't bound in a complex and sophisticated way, if they were still all here for me together, they would be phenomenally unified. And so that's what phenomenal unity is. And there's this, and because it's quite basic, there's I think some pressure on panpsychists to treat it as a fundamental property, not as something that's going to be reducible to a summary of more basic variables. And that's why I think there's some pressure to seeing it going kind of more or less universally throughout the universe, which is what I call the micro-unity hypothesis. And that's probably what you're about to read back to me.
Yeah, part of it. It's how you end this one particular chapter.
Okay.
But you say, because of experience inheritance, all aggregates of these fundamental entities will also be conscious, sharing the experiences of their parts. This is a universalist form of panpsychism. And because of the micro-unity hypothesis, all aggregates whose parts physically interact will have composite experiences which unify those many simple experiences. Indeed, overlapping aggregates with interacting parts will share these composite experiences with each other. In short, consciousness works just like other basic physical properties.
Mhm.
So yeah, I thought that was I like that, just that final thought of like this is already how we think it works, like with physical properties. This is just like a panpsychist version of, how we kind of already think the physical world operates anyway.
And that's kind of the motivation for panpsychism. The reason why people often want to be panpsychists rather than emergentists or dualists is this sense that, like, okay, the hard problem forces us to stop trying to reduce phenomenal consciousness to something else. We have to accept it as, an additional fundamental ingredient in the world. We have to add it to our picture of reality. But it's much more attractive, scientifically and theoretically, for us to add it as another thing that works the way that the other fundamentals work. Something that's present generally, something that's simple, something that isn't like specifically confined to humans, something that's not anthropocentric. And so, yeah, so a lot of, exactly what I'm trying to evoke in that passage is that aspiration to see consciousness in a way that harmonizes it with the fundamental physical properties.
Just to turn back around for a second to phenomenal unity, something that I wanted to mention was that, it's not like this is just a problem for panpsychists or something. Like, something you've mentioned in your work is that this is basically a problem for everyone who's not a dualist. Like, someone who, like, the only people who don't really have some kind of combination problem are people who think that the mind is this absolutely simple thing. But, physicalists, certain versions of the combination problem, because like every other problem in philosophy, the X problem actually turns out to be like a family of problems. But certain versions of the combination problem equally apply to physicalism. And sometimes I'll kind of snarkily add that like physicalists just haven't figured this out yet because they're still mired in all of their other problems, whereas panpsychists have gotten past some of those problems and have been exploring new terrain and have, kind of stumbled on new areas that physicalists have yet to explore.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I was talking a moment ago about connecting up, that we have our 12 men with each with one word, and we're connecting up their brains by some kind of futuristic enhanced communication device until it's like a single 12 hemisphere brain. What's that going to be like? how many subjects are present there? And if there's a different number of subjects present at the end than there are at the beginning, when did it change? Like, these are questions that you don't get out of answering by not being a panpsychist. And some physicalists have talked about this, like Churchland briefly mentions something like that thought experiment, not with 12 people, but with two minds being connected in a, I think, kind of in passing in a footnote. And so, so part of what really prompted me to actually kind of to begin the project that became Combining Minds was actually finding the way that this plays out a few hundred years ago in the simplicity argument against physicalism. So one of the kind of standard arguments that, in some strands of medieval and early modern philosophy, one of the standard arguments against materialism or physicalism, I mean, they would call it materialism, was that, look, all material things are divisible, infinitely divisible into parts. And not just divisible, but kind of reducible to their parts. The properties of a material thing are just the properties of its parts and the way they're connected and that kind of adding up. But the mind, they say, is not like that. The mind is simple. The mind doesn't have parts. And they'll kind of use analogies that are a little bit like William James's, 12 men with one word each. They'll say, if the mind was divisible, it would be like, my different senses, for instance, would be like two different people. And, if one person, goes to the perfume counter and smells things, and another person goes to the art gallery and sees things, there's no awareness of seeing and smelling together. And so if my nose and my eye were kind of each had a mind, there'd be no awareness of the smelling and the seeing together. And they say, therefore, materialism must be false. And one of the interesting things that Kant says is this. He says, like, this is a really good argument. It's a shame that you cannot make valid metaphysical arguments, but if you could, this would be one of the strongest. I mean, he calls it the Achilles of all, rationalist metaphysical arguments, meaning it's the greatest warrior, but it has a fatal flaw. He thinks the fatal flaw is that you just shouldn't try to do metaphysics at all. And kind of after Kant, there's this period where people don't really do metaphysics, or at least they kind of are approaching metaphysics through various sort of mediations. But so I do kind of think that the combination problem of the 20th century and 21st century is sort of a lot of these worries that in an earlier time were worries against materialism resurfacing in a kind of different guise.
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, something else they said is like, well, because the soul is like indivisible, and then it can't be destroyed because it can't be broken into component parts, and that's what destruction is. So the soul, like, not if it's indivisible, then it's also like immortal, which is an interesting argument.
Yeah, and I think often, you can often tell, particularly with the Christian writers, this is, the tail that's wagging the dog, that immortality is one of the really important things for them to defend. Or as they put it, natural immortality. Like there's this idea that the only way for something to be naturally destroyed is for its parts to dissolve, to separate. A simple thing could only be destroyed by a miraculous act of God. God could annihilate it. And so they want to say, look, the soul is naturally immortal, and here's our proof of that. And the materialists would be a threat to this, and therefore, persecute them and don't persecute me. And so I think part of why it's not as widely recognized as a problem is that, there isn't that pressing kind of socio-ethical religious connection to it. But yeah, I think the underlying issues are still lurking and still come up in other contexts.
I just in case we didn't make it explicit enough, could you lay out experience inheritance, like just that thesis in a nutshell?
Sure. So experience inheritance is modeled on principles like location inheritance, which people like Peter van Inwagen and a lot of other metaphysicians take it to just be like a very obvious axiom that for every spatial location property of a part or something, the whole also has that property. So, I am located here because my hand is. That is, I just inherit that spatial property of occupying this bit of space. I inherit other properties as well. So I'm not, I'm located where my hand is and also at some other places. But it just seems like a very obvious fact that wholes inherit that sort of property from their parts.
Right, like mass, like if some object has a certain mass, like it inherits all the mass of its component parts. It's not like there's some combination problem with mass.
And it's also not like there has to be extra mass. If my lower half weighs X and my upper half weighs Y, and I weigh X plus Y, it's not like when I step on the scale it will register X plus Y plus X plus Y. We don't double count. And so experience inheritance is essentially a formulation of the idea that whatever the fundamental experiential properties are, whatever the most basic little ingredients which complex experiences can be resolved into, whatever they are, they'll obey the same principle. The whole inherits them from its parts, potentially along with other properties from its other parts. And that's kind of the principle, that explains why it is that the sun pinky cat has the experiences that the sun and the cat and the pinky do. And it also explains, why the whole that is me inherits trillions and trillions of incredibly simple experiences from all of the particles that make me up. There are some further principles that we need to work through to explain why those fit together into the complex experiences I have. But experience inheritance is just saying, look, the raw materials are present equally in the whole and in the parts.
And in the book, though, you say this is an a priori truth. So, I mean, why do you think that it's in that category?
So I think this is an a priori truth because I think it follows from that idea I've mentioned earlier, that composition is identity, that the part and the whole aren't really different things. That at least in one important sense of the phrase whole, a whole is just its parts considered together. And I think that if that's the case, then, things have the same properties as themselves. And so whatever properties belong to it, considered as many parts, will also belong to it considered as one whole. The caveat to that is that some properties are division relative. So, to take a simple example, if I take a bunch of square bricks and I arrange them into a circle, the parts are square and the whole is circular. So it looks like there's a difference in properties there between the part and the whole. The explanation for that is that being square or circular, that's a property that is relative to not just which areas of space you fill, but which areas you don't fill. So it's set by these boundaries. And since the whole will inherit not just, it filling the space that one part fills, but also filling the space the other parts fill, meaning that it doesn't inherit the absences, it doesn't inherit the boundaries of each part. There's logically has to be a difference in how that property works when applied, relative to the division into many parts or relative to the division into one whole. Even though it's still the same reality, it's the same thing, we can still say, as a whole, it's round, as parts, it's square.
Right.
Or, yeah.
Right. So the boundaries are not inherited.
Boundaries are not inherited, but fundamental properties are. If you can't kind of derive that failure of inheritance by saying, look, here's what it means to be square. It means to have this boundary to not fill the space on the far side of the boundary. And if a property is really fundamental and you don't have an analysis of it that generates that discrepancy, it should be inherited just because the parts are the whole and vice versa.
So, so that passage I read earlier, the reason I chose it is not just that, ending part where it's like, hey, we're not like making up new rules here. Like this is already how the physical world kind of works. I thought that was an important point, but also just that experiential inheritance in the micro-unity hypothesis, that those are like two crucial moving parts to your like solution to the combination problem. But it seems like there might be a couple problems that non-physicalists might have. You address them in the book, but I just wanted to bring them up because it seems related, especially to that last thing you just said about boundaries. So I think there's this John Searle quote where he says, like, there has to be a place where my consciousness ends and yours begins. So there seems to be like this like boundary, I guess, between consciousnesses. And we mentioned this, I think, before we started recording, how it seems like there might be a conflict with privacy as well here. Like the idea that conscious experiences are not really accessible from the outside, so to speak. Actually, that might have been when we were recording. I'm not sure. So can we address first the conflict with privacy? Because I think these are sort of related objections here. But yeah, specifically with like the idea that I have private subjective experiences that are not accessible from the outside. Is that really in conflict with what you're saying here?
No. So do you mind if I actually just pause to say briefly what the micro-unity hypothesis is? Because I know that I've defined the experience inheritance as a principle. So the micro-unity hypothesis is an answer to the question, well, where does phenomenal unity come from, or how widely does it extend? Because again, I think if you think of consciousness as a fundamental property, you would probably think of phenomenal unity as a fundamental relation. And for by now familiar kind of vagueness and continuity worries, I think it's going to be very hard to find a non-arbitrary kind of stopping point for like, why should there be phenomenal unity among all of my experiences and not between my experiences and other experiences. So the micro-unity hypothesis says phenomenal unity goes with, perhaps in some sense is, one or another of the fundamental physical relations. The fundamental physical relations are things like spatial distance, the basic forces, basic interactions. I mean, whatever physics turns out to say it is. And that's very close to being a strict universalism. Potentially it means that like my experiences might not be unified phenomenally with the experiences of things outside my light cone, but that's so far away that it's kind of not really relevant to practical questions about like which sorts of composites have phenomenal unity and which don't. So it's kind of another part of this overall push towards universalism.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's different from experience inheritance because it's not an a priori claim. The distribution of fundamental relations looks to be an a posteriori matter.
I have another quote here that sums up the difference here. Experience inheritance says that when parts have experiences, so do wholes, while the micro-unity hypothesis says that when experiences stand in certain relations, their sum is an experience.
Yep. And the relations in question are just whatever the fundamental relations are according to physics. Mm-hmm. One or all of those are where phenomenal unity goes. But so one of the implications of this is this sort of boundary worry, that it looks like my experiences are phenomenally unified with yours. And I think when people say, look, there has to be a point where my experience stops, I mean, the first answer to that is that nothing I've said, nothing in combinationism implies that there isn't. If consciousness works the same way that physical combination works, then that doesn't mean that there's no boundaries to things or there's no place where anything stops. There's a place where my physical brain stops. There's a place where, if I breathe out, there's a place where my breath stops. It's vague, but we can draw a boundary. So there's something always a little puzzling about these phrases that people like Searle say, like what sets the boundary? Where does it stop? Like things that combine have boundaries. But I think part of the intuition that is being kind of mobilized there is this feeling that wherever my consciousness stops should be like a real breach, a boundary that is so insuperable that no phenomenal relations cross it. And so, my brain is bounded, but it has physical relations to the things on the other side of the boundary, just as it has physical relations among its parts. And so that's the sense in which I guess my version of panpsychism is denying that kind of boundedness. It's saying, yeah, there's a point where your consciousness stops, maybe a vague point, but we can draw a boundary. But the relations among the parts of your consciousness also hold across that boundary between you and the things on the other side. And so part of what I'm doing in the book is I'm saying, look, we should just give up this intuition of boundedness. We can explain where it comes from, because we can relate it to the limited powers of kind of phenomenal introspection. So I like this analogy with a light, what's it called, a lamppost. If it's very dark and I've got a lamppost, the lamppost will illuminate an area of sidewalk underneath me. And I look over and I can see another lamppost and it's illuminating another area of sidewalk. I can't see what's in between. And so I might think, well, there's, my sidewalk is cut off from that other bit of sidewalk. There's the two little circular islands. But that would be a mistake. That would be kind of over-interpreting what the light is showing. All the light shows me is that there's continuity of the sidewalk underneath me and underneath them, and it's compatible with what we know actually is the case, that the sidewalk extends all the way between us. It's just one sidewalk with two areas of it illuminated. So likewise, the micro-unity hypothesis implies that, look, I can introspect like an area of the big field of unified experiences in the world. You know, what I call my experience is the area here that is covered by a single set of introspective mechanisms that can kind of synthesize information and allow me to have an overall impression of, look, okay, what's going on locally, you know, that I can then report to you in words. And, you know, your brain is also synthesizing information, generating this introspective impression of the local experiences over there, and you can express it in words. And each of us can kind of infer, oh, there's an area over there that is covered by an introspective synthesis. And that's like the lampposts. But phenomenal unity is like the sidewalk. It extends between us. The lamppost light, the introspective mechanisms allow us to see it, allow us to recognize, oh, these experiences are all hanging together. And they don't illuminate the unity between my experiences and yours. They don't allow me to introspectively synthesize all of that. But they don't show me that the phenomenal unity is absent. They just fail to show me that it's present.
And this would also roughly be how you would answer the privacy objection, which seems to me to be like motivating a lot of this sort of, okay, at the end of the day, there is something that you don't have access to. And would you explain that in the same way that you're like using the street lamps?
Yeah, to an extent. So I see that as kind of a couple of steps downstream in the argument. So I think because people think that the illumination is the boundary of the street light, of the pavement, because people think phenomenal unity only goes as far as I can introspect and then stops. They think, well, if my experiences were phenomenally unified with other people's, if we were all kind of parts of this big continuous field of consciousness, then I ought to be able to introspect other people's experiences. I ought to be able to close my eyes and tell what Emerson is thinking. And I can't, therefore there's no phenomenal unity there. And I'm trying to kind of cut that off before we get to that worry. So that's one of the ways that the observation of privacy between me and you, I think, wrongly generates objections to mental combination. There's also the issue of privacy between me and my parts, where I have to say something slightly different. There I say, you do have direct access to another subject's experiences. You know, if every particle in my brain is a very simple conscious subject, if each of my hemispheres is a kind of medium complexity subject, I'm able to introspect their experiences because their experiences are also my experiences. And so that's one way in which I'm qualifying the claim of privacy. But that is compatible with recognizing that I can't do that into your experiences because you're not part of me. And so that's why I think that I am preserving enough privacy for us to kind of still recognize that consciousness is private, and that's a really fundamental and deep fact about it. That conflicts with the publicity of material things and physical facts. But it's qualified enough to allow me to introspect the experiences of, the other subjects, which are my parts, because they're not really other, they're parts of me.
I'm trying to connect this to the more general kind of Russellian picture, I guess, of like seeing consciousness as the intrinsic nature of matter. Because I always just thought that, well, yeah, I mean, the intrinsic nature is not publicly observable. And like the only reason we even know about it is because we are, like physical entities, like we're a part of the natural world. And, we are the thing in itself in some sense, like, but that's it. So, I mean, does that conflict in any way with what you're saying? Like, I'm saying that there's privacy because when we talk about privacy, what we're really talking about is the intrinsic nature of matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah. Like experiences are what physical things are like to themselves, and the properties we're used to describing in physical terms, that's how they are to other things, to things outside them. And so once you see that division, like, of course, the way something is to itself, it can't be to other things. I can't have that access to you without being you or being part of you.
So I'm becoming mindful of your time here. I don't want to keep you all day here, but I did want to ask you. Well, first I wanted to give you a chance to add anything that we might have missed before I move on to some other issues.
I think we've covered a good range of issues. Yeah, I don't particularly want to. Yeah, I can't think of anything specifically to add.
Okay, so I think we've solved the combination problem. So since that's put to one side now, I did want to ask you about sort of practical implications of panpsychism. How long have you been attracted to this view? So I mean, like, how long have you been kind of walking around with panpsychist thoughts in your head?
I wrote something that I hesitate to describe as an essay. It's really more like a series of chaotic meditations called "What Is It Like to Be an Electron?" When I was 16 or 17. So at this point, it's been a good 15 years or so that I've been strongly leaning panpsychist. I mean, even now, I don't know if I'd say I'm certain this is true.
Mm-hmm.
I defend it because I think it has a good chance of being true, and I think it's valuable to work out, a working version of it for people. But yeah, it's been a good 15 years, I think, or so. I think.
Cool. No, I feel the same way. Like sometimes I'm thinking, like, should I have any significant credence in like any of these metaphysical hypotheses? Like, it all seems so subjective about like, what you're bringing to the table and like what seems like a more solid thing to like a more solid leg to stand on than something else. And then, you do that 20 times and you end up just on like completely different ends of the spectrum. And it's like, I don't know if like, yeah. So, I mean, if you force me to pick one, then I would choose panpsychism. And then I have kind of like a runner up, but I do kind of wonder if I should have like any significant credence in like any metaphysical hypothesis, like physicalism or dualism or anything. Like the only thing that would really settle it for me is if the world suddenly became populated by ghosts, and then I would have to be a dualist. But other than that, I can't really think of anything.
I mean, if you can tell that the world is populated by ghosts and the ghosts are having some kind of physical manifestation,
Mm-hmm.
looks like if they're having physical manifestations, then it's only a matter of time before, our current physics has expanded to include, ghostology.
Yeah,
We might just expand the definition of physical to include ectoplasm.
that's true. Yeah, if Chomsky is right, then in physical, the only thing it really means is that we take it seriously and it plays some explanatory role. Then pretty soon ghosts will be physical.
Perhaps. I mean, Eric Schwitzgebel has defended kind of universal weirdness hypothesis that whatever the right answer is to the mind-body problem, it must be something weird, meaning in particular that not only does it have strange implications, but we're not compelled to adopt it. So like there are lots of views here, but none of them is so well supported that we have to believe that. But you were asking a bit about moral implications.
Yeah, well, just practical implications. I mean, that's why I wanted to know how long you'd been a panpsychist, because if there was like a significant amount of like before panpsychist time and after, and then just the duration. But yeah, I mean, not just moral implications, but just any practical implication that you can detect in yourself, like environmental ethics, animal ethics, just your orientation in the natural world or spiritual practice or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people bring this up as a problem. They ask me, so why are you vegan if you're a panpsychist? Like, aren't plants conscious too? And so I have been doing some work recently on like, how much can a panpsychist preserve of this intuitive idea that consciousness is the basis of value? And I want to say something like, for it to have any practical implications, the value of consciousness has to be tied to particular sorts of consciousness, particularly sort of consciousness that we associate with positively and negatively valenced experiences, possibly with desire and motivation. And I think that our intuitive impressions of which things are and are not conscious are liable to be a better guide to particular sorts of consciousness than they are to the presence or absence of consciousness per se. So that's why I'm cautiously inclined to think that plants may not have suffering and happiness, and that's for now why I still eat them. Well, no, okay, part of why I still eat them. I also still eat them for the kind of philosophically uninteresting reason that animal agriculture typically destroys more plant life than plant agriculture does, because you need to feed plants to the animals. But that doesn't connect so much to my research. Has there been a... Part of me wants to say yes, because I think panpsychism is quite consonant with an environmentalist ethics. I think it, particularly like if you think, well, consciousness is valuable, maybe everything has some gradation or some form of consciousness, it kind of puts you in the frame of mind of looking for gradations of value more widely in the world, and not having like a sharp division between the things like us, which have value, and then everything else is like a mere resource for that. At the same time, I don't want to be unfair to materialists, because I think like a non-panpsychist materialist, it's not really that they have any good reason for having like a sharp division between the value of humans and the value of everything else, because they precisely don't think that there's something special and unique involved in consciousness that we have and everything else lacks. Materialism is sort of the view that consciousness is not as special and magical as it seems. And so there's been some interesting discussions recently where non-physicalists have accused physicalists of being, unable to sustain like any sort of moral system. Like if you think that consciousness isn't really special after all, then you kind of cut out the basis for thinking that consciousness should matter morally. It no longer seems like there's a good reason to think that pain is, worse than any other brain state. And I'm not sure if that's right, but I do think that, I think that if physicalism could sustain a coherent ethics that cared about consciousness, then it would also be consonant with environmentalism the same way that panpsychism is, because it would have to say, look, whatever it is that's special about our consciousness, it's just physical information processing. Physical information processing is very widespread. It's present in its different gradations all throughout the world. So like, so there's a book that I've read parts of, but not all of, by Freya Matthews, which is about panpsychist environmentalism. It's called For Matter. Mm-hmm. And I kind of like that, like whether you're a physicalist or a panpsychist, that you and everything you love is just matter. And so in a sense, like, you shouldn't take that to mean that, oh, if I don't care about matter, I shouldn't care about people and plants and animals. You should take that the other way. If I care about people and plants and animals, if I care about anything, I have to love matter. I have to be, I have to see everything in the world as a little bit magical rather than seeing nothing as magical.
Yeah, I love Freya Matthews. I've been or Freya Matthews, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but no, I downloaded The Ecological Self and also For the Love of Matter, and just this whole, I've been intrigued by that branch of panpsychist thought, I guess, of trying to connect it to not only like environmental ethics, but to some kind of like deeper spiritual practice, as like providing the philosophical underpinnings for, I don't know, I don't know, I want to choose my words carefully here, but some kind of like paganism or nature worship or something along those lines. Like panpsychism could provide some underpinnings for a view like that. And I actually came across this one I think he's a pagan. He said something on Twitter the other day where he was like, I feel like panpsychists are saying something like what we've been saying all along. And I took that to be, kind of encouraging. I was like, I think he meant it as like slightly dismissive, like you're taking this like rationalist approach to get to the same like summit of the same mountain. And I was like, cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I am in a Facebook group called Atheo-Paganism, which is, like a branch of paganism that I have some sympathy with, which is like trying to be resolutely rationalistic in the sense of like, atheist. Like there's no gods, there's no spirits or ghosts or anything that would, like, if that's in conflict with scientific naturalism. But at the same time, scientific naturalism shouldn't mean that you like care about the earth less or respect it or venerate it less. It should, if anything, mean, caring about it more. And my disciplinary training as an analytic philosopher is not always super well suited to like exploring, how these metaphysical doctrines translate into like an existential orientation towards life.
Mhm.
But it is an area that I am trying to explore more and think about more.
Yeah, I wish it was more like that, a little bit at least. Analytic philosophy, I mean. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this doesn't apply to you, because I think that your book is very like well written and clear and readable. But there's some analytic philosophy that reads like a vacuum cleaner assembly manual, and it's like, who holds you people that you have to write this badly, like, or like you can't deal with anything existential or like stuff that I don't know, like Thomas Nagel when he starts off. I'm blanking on the name of the book right now, but he says something about how continental philosophy sort of stands in better relation to the public, like like it has more purchase in the public mind because it seems more like wise, I guess, or it seems more like directly applicable. It's not like math with words.
Yeah, I mean, there's this. It is a little perverse sometimes that the watchword for analytic philosophy is often clarity, and sometimes it has these results that seem not. I think really what it is that clarity can mean two different things. It can mean how quickly people get a meaning from what you're saying, and it can mean how reliably they get the exact meaning that you intended them to get. Something like, vivacity versus precision. And often, to enhance precision, you have to hedge more. You introduce algebraic variables to make it clear, when I say this person, which this person was it? Well, it was person J3. You use more and more technical terms because they've been defined to have more and more precise meanings. But you're often moving away from that kind of immediacy, and you're kind of raising the bar for how much work people have to put in to understand a given sentence. Whereas, if you optimize in the other direction for a different kind of clarity, you can end up saying things that are, everyone reads them and immediately thinks, oh, I know exactly what this person means, but they all have a different idea of what it is that they've picked up from it. So there is always a challenge of trying to do both. I think, I'm sympathetic with the algebraic strategies that you often see in like technical writing or professional academic writing. They are kind of optimizing for precision at the cost of vivacity. But I also think, sometimes it can become a habit and you need to ask yourself, if I reorganize this sentence, can I make it equally unambiguous without any algebra? And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. I don't know. Everything in life is trade-offs, so I don't know what to do.
No, I mean, I feel the same exact way with. I'm not an academic. I have no intention of trying to be, but just with podcasting, like when you think like today, I've just been talking to you, and I've just been kind of zeroed in on talking to you like at the level at which I understand things, and it's like that's going to leave some people behind because they haven't put as much time into. I'm not smarter than those people. It's just I've, for some reason, spent more time reading about panpsychism and stuff than they have. And I, on the one hand, I feel bad about leaving some people behind by not explaining every little thing. But on the other hand, it's like I would like to just get what I can get from you and like see what you have to say to these questions I have. And like, yeah, it's like it is this trade-off between like, do you want people to be able to tell what you're saying, or do you want to cover some new and interesting ground that hasn't been covered in any podcast before? I don't know what to do either, is what I'm saying.
Like trade-offs.
I did want to come back to your ethical implications, though, about how, just because something might be conscious doesn't necessarily mean it has this like morally salient consciousness that we would be like really troubled by. I think that's right. I mean, one thing that some people will say, oh, well, if you think plants are conscious, then like, how can you be a vegan or vegetarian or something? It's like, well, the first thing I want to ask you is if you're a vegan or vegetarian, because if you're not, then how is that an excuse anyway? Like I'm just saying the person who's bringing up this objection, it's like, anyway, putting that to one side though, it's like, you can kind of inductively infer that things like plants and trees are not having the same experiences that we're having because they're not capable of having the same reactions that we have. So it seems like if trees were in excruciating pain when you chop them down, they would have evolved some kind of way of responding and reacting to that, to their environment. But the fact that they can't really react in the complex ways that we can or other things can does kind of lead me to believe that like they're just not having the same kind of inner life that we're having.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And I actually want to, I guess, push back a little because a lot of trees do have responses that are prompted by say, leaf damage.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of trees, if the leaves are damaged in a particular way, that will prompt them to synthesize more of a chemical that is, repellent to the particular herbivore, which in their evolutionary environment has tended to produce that kind of damage. And sometimes it gets really complicated. Sometimes it's that they release a chemical into the air which attracts a predator that will eat that insect. And sometimes it's that some kind of signal, clearly we don't know, we can't track the signal, but we can infer some signal has been sent through the root networks to other trees nearby, and then they will have more of this chemical in their leaves. So there is responsiveness to stimuli. What I think is possibly more important than responses to stimuli is integration. So the thing is, if you want a system that will just respond in one specific way to one specific stimuli or stimulus, you can kind of just build in a link, something like a reflex action. The value of pain is not to facilitate the reflexes. The pain that I experience when I touch the red hot stove only kicks in after I've reflexively pulled my hand away. It takes a few milliseconds, a few hundred milliseconds more than that. What it does is it allows me to integrate the aversiveness, or, kind of the motivational upshot there into things like future planning, learning, associationism. It also cuts through my attention. So if I have attention is how I deal with the fact that I have 100 different stimuli coming in. There's 100 different things that I could do with them, and pain is really salient. Pain grabs my attention, but as far as we can tell, functionally and anatomically, it doesn't look like plants face that problem. That is, it doesn't look like they have a central hub where all the stimuli are coming in that will then coordinate and give a response to all of that synthesizes that information. And so it's not clear that they have any of the functional needs that pain seems to serve in us. beyond a reflex reaction. And so that's something in a presentation I gave a year or so ago about what should a panpsychist say about plant consciousness, that I keep meaning to try and write up in a paper. But I mean that's not necessarily disagreeing with what you're saying, but things do get complicated when we start asking, well, what are the functional signatures of a certain kind of experience that we should look for? How should we expect plants to behave if they had an experience, given that they do behave in ways that are in some ways surprising, given a kind of popular picture of them as purely passive?
Yeah, all that Secret Life of Trees stuff, that, like, I mean, that really popped off because they just seem like these inanimate, like, just passive things. Yeah, and then you find out that they communicate, they have like all these, like, I hesitate to call them like social relationships, but they do kind of like divvy up resources according to like kin and all kinds of weird things that are going on, like that are not obvious just with our passing familiarity with trees, but you actually have to study them more closely. And yeah, you find out that they're these very active organisms, but yeah, just because they can't run away when you start chopping them down. So, I mean, there's so much of your work. You have just a mass of work that's been piling up over years, and all of it's interesting. Like, I think that you're a really a really interesting philosopher of mind, and I really am glad that I got the chance to talk to you. But I highly recommend your book to anyone who's interested in I mean, obviously panpsychism, but even if you're not, like, this is just like Combining Minds is a good book to read if you're interested in philosophy of mind, period. But yeah, I think Richard Brown, when you went on his podcast, he said, I think the same thing, where I mean, he's like an identity theorist, which is like the worst kind of materialist. No, but just kidding. But no, he was like he was also very he spoke really highly of the book and of your work. So I mean, I am just a layman who's interested in these sorts of things, but yeah, your work comes super highly recommended from me.
Well, that is high praise. Honestly, I think for academic work to get praise from a layman is often, a higher bar to meet than praise from academics. So I do appreciate you saying that, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. This has been super interesting.
Thanks. No, I've enjoyed it as well, and I didn't realize that I had that kind of power over academics. Apparently, my layman approval is worth something. So, on that note, is there any place that you want people to find you, or if they're interested in finding your work, where they should go?
LukeRoelofs.com is my go-to website. It has links to a few of my other bits of online presence, my Phil Papers profile, my personal blog. Has all my papers downloadable from there. Yeah, I think that would be the place.
Excellent. All right, Luke Roelofs, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really great experience.